The morning fog over the Svatov-Kremenna sector did not merely conceal the horizon, it swallowed an entire army. For months, the front line had been a grueling, static nightmare of artillery duels, drone-infested skies, and frozen trenches, a war measured in meters and casualties. But on the morning of October 14, the paradigm of the entire conflict shifted in a matter of 6 hours. What took place was not a tactical retreat, nor was it a structured withdrawal under pressure. It was the absolute, catastrophic evaporation of an entire frontline sector, an unprecedented military vacuum that saw an estimated 100,000 Russian personnel simply vanish from the theater of war. The sheer scale of the collapse has left military analysts, intelligence agencies, and international observers scrambling for answers, questioning how a heavily fortified defensive network backed by layers of armor, advanced electronic warfare suites, and entrenched infantry could dissolve into absolute nothingness between dawn and noon. The catalyst for the collapse began not with a massive artillery barrage, but with a total and terrifying silence. At exactly 4:15 a.m., all Russian communication networks across the Luhansk Oblast went completely dark. Electronic warfare was initially suspected, but the blackout was too absolute, affecting not just high-frequency military radios but cellular networks, satellite uplinks, fiber-optic command lines, and encrypted localized command channels. Within 30 minutes, frontline units found themselves entirely isolated, unable to contact their immediate command structures, coordinate with neighboring battalions, or request fire support from the rear. It was in this window of absolute digital blindness that the frontline began to fracture from within. According to leaked signal intelligence reports, the panic did not start with an enemy advance, but with a cascading series of false orders circulating through the few remaining operational analog channels, instructing units to abandon their heavy equipment and fall back to secondary defensive lines that did not exist. As the sun rose, the reality of the disaster became visible from drone surveillance feeds. Entire motorized rifle brigades, instead of holding their deeply fortified concrete bunkers and dragon's teeth obstacles, were seen streaming backward in a disorganized, frantic exodus. The panic was infectious. When the 144th Guards Motorized Rifle Division observed neighboring units abandoning their flanks, the fear of encirclement triggered a domino effect. Roads leading eastward toward the Russian border became choked with a chaotic mix of logistical trucks, civilian vehicles seized by fleeing troops, and disorganized infantry marching on foot through the mud. Tank crews, finding themselves without fuel or orders, chose to spike their barrels and abandon state-of-the-art T-90M main battle tanks in perfect working order, leaving them scattered along the muddy roadsides like metal carcasses. By midday, the collapse had reached the operational command level. The regional headquarters in Starobilsk was found completely abandoned, with classified documents fluttering across the courtyard and computer terminals smashed with axes. The chain of command had not just broken, it had ceased to exist. Field officers, realizing that no reinforcements were coming and that their positions were entirely exposed, joined the retreat, leaving behind vast ammunition depots and sophisticated anti-aircraft systems completely intact. The specialized defensive lines that had taken over a year to construct, complete with extensive minefields, anti-tank ditches, and reinforced pillboxes, were bypassed not by the enemy, but by the very forces assigned to defend them. Rumors quickly began to fill the information void, spreading like wildfire through social media channels and military blogging communities. Some claimed a highly sophisticated cyber weapon had completely hijacked the Russian digital command infrastructure, sending automated, authenticated surrender demands to every field commander simultaneously. Others whispered of a massive, coordinated mutiny within the ranks, sparked by months of withheld pay, broken logistics, and severe food shortages. The most extreme theories suggested the deployment of an unannounced psychological warfare technology that induced mass panic and cognitive disorientation among the troops. Whatever the true cause, the result remained undeniable: a front line stretching over 80 kilometers had been entirely emptied of its defensive forces. The strategic implications of this sudden vacuum are staggering. With no organized resistance left in the sector, advancing elements face no opposition other than the very minefields the retreating forces left behind. The entire northern flank of the Russian campaign has been compromised, exposing vital logistical hubs and supply lines that feed operations further south. International military experts are calling this the most significant single-day territorial and manpower loss in modern military history, drawing parallels to the historic routes of antiquity rather than the calculated maneuvers of 21st-century warfare. The sheer speed of the dissolution has caught even Western intelligence agencies off guard, as satellite imagery confirmed that areas housing tens of thousands of troops just 24 hours prior are now entirely desolate. In Moscow, the silence from official channels has been deafening. The Ministry of Defense issued a brief, highly ambiguous statement referencing a planned regrouping to more advantageous tactical positions, a narrative that stands in stark contrast to the chaotic footage filling the internet. State television networks abruptly altered their broadcasting schedules, replacing live political talk shows with historical documentaries and classical music concerts, a traditional sign of internal political crisis and narrative management. Behind closed doors, the blame game has reportedly begun, with unconfirmed reports of high-ranking generals being relieved of their duties or detained by state security services in a frantic search for scapegoats to explain the unexplainable. Meanwhile, the humanitarian and logistical chaos on the ground continues to escalate. The sudden influx of tens of thousands of disorganized, armed, and deeply demoralized soldiers crossing back over the international border has overwhelmed local authorities in the Belgorod and Voronezh regions. Temporary transit camps have been hastily established, but they lack the capacity to handle the sheer volume of personnel. Reports are emerging of widespread looting and clashes between fleeing frontline soldiers and internal security forces trying to restore order and establish checkpoints to prevent the armed collapse from bleeding deeper into the Russian heartland. As the dust begins to settle on this extraordinary day, the true cost of the collapse is becoming apparent. It is not merely a loss of territory or expensive military hardware, it is a profound, systemic psychological defeat. The illusion of a rigid, unbreakable defensive wall has been shattered in a single morning, revealing a structural fragility that few suspected was so advanced. The event has fundamentally altered the trajectory of the geopolitical landscape, leaving allies and adversaries alike to recalibrate their strategies in the wake of a day when an entire army simply erased itself from the map. The front line has collapsed, the trenches are empty, and the repercussions of October 14 will echo through military academies and capitals for decades to come. To truly understand how 100,000 men could vanish from an active war zone in less than 6 hours, one must look at the structural decay that had been festering beneath the surface for months. Frontline intelligence reports compiled by independent monitors paint a grim picture of the weeks leading up to the disaster. Supply lines had slowly degraded into a state of near-total paralysis. Ammunition convoys were routinely targeted by low-cost FPV drones, leaving artillery batteries with strict rationing orders. Soldiers in the trenches were reportedly surviving on expired rations and contaminated well water, leading to widespread outbreaks of dysentery and trench fever. When the communication blackout hit, it acted as a spark in a powder keg of resentment and exhaustion. The men were not just physically tired, they were psychologically hollowed out, waiting for a reason to break. The role of the phantom orders cannot be overstated in the anatomy of this collapse. Investigations into the analog radio transmissions revealed that the voice authorizing the withdrawal was an exact AI-generated replica of General Alexander Lapin, the regional commander. The deepfake broadcast was pushed with such immense signal power that it overrode local command frequencies, instructing battalion commanders that an imminent tactical nuclear strike or devastating chemical bombardment was about to occur in their sector. To the terrified, isolated, and exhausted soldiers on the ground, the order to flee felt not like an act of cowardice, but a desperate directive for survival issued by their highest authority. By the time genuine officers attempted to counteract the fake orders using physical couriers, the roads were already blocked by thousands of retreating vehicles, making it impossible to stem the tide. The economic and material loss incurred during those fateful 6 hours is almost incalculable. Preliminary assessments based on aerial reconnaissance indicate that over 400 main battle tanks, 800 armored personnel carriers, and 300 heavy artillery pieces were left behind in the mud. Entire maintenance depots, filled with spare parts, replacement engines, and thousands of tons of diesel fuel, were abandoned without a single match being lit to destroy them. Military historians point out that not since the opening days of Operation Barbarossa has a modern military force abandoned such a staggering amount of hardware to an opponent without engaging in a major pitched battle. The loss effectively strips the entire Western military district of its operational reserve, leaving a gaping wound in the logistics of the entire campaign. As the retreating masses pressed closer to the Russian border, the chaos took on a tribal, localized survival dynamic. Without centralized direction, different units began competing for limited resources along the escape routes. The 4th Guards Tank Division reportedly engaged in brief firefights with elements of local paramilitary security detachments over access to fuel stations near the border town of Veliky. Heavy vehicles ran out of gas in the middle of narrow bridges, creating monumental traffic jams that stretched back for 20 kilometers. Soldiers simply walked away from their multi-million-dollar anti-aircraft missile systems, leaving them parked on highway medians, and continued their journey on foot, discarding their body armor and helmets along the ditches to lighten their load. The international community watched the event unfold in a state of absolute, paralyzed disbelief. In Washington, an emergency meeting of the National Security Council was called in the early hours of the morning. Satellites had captured the sudden, massive thermal signatures of hundreds of vehicles moving eastward simultaneously, initially triggering fears of a massive new offensive or a provocative troop maneuver. When analysts realized the direction of the movement was backward, the mood in the room shifted from tension to profound shock. Pentagon officials reportedly reached out through the deconfliction hotline to Moscow to ensure that the Russian leadership understood the situation was internal and not the result of direct external intervention, fearing a panicked escalatory response from a blindsided Kremlin. The geopolitical shockwaves immediately rippled through global financial markets. The price of crude oil experienced an unprecedented intraday drop of 12%, as traders anticipated a rapid and chaotic end to the conflict and a potential restructuring of energy corridors. Conversely, the value of defense contractor stocks plummeted as the myth of a prolonged, decade-long conventional war of attrition dissolved in a single morning. European capitals, particularly those in close proximity to the eastern borders, immediately placed their border guards and internal security forces on high alert, terrified that the armed disintegration of the frontline could spill over into an unmanageable crisis involving thousands of rogue, heavily armed deserting soldiers wandering the continent. Inside the borders of Russia, the sheer volume of the returning defeated army made concealment impossible. By late afternoon, social media platforms were flooded with shaky smartphone videos recorded by civilians in the Belgorod Oblast. The footage showed columns of dirty, hollow-eyed soldiers walking down suburban streets, some begging for food, others attempting to trade their military rifles for civilian clothing. Local police forces, completely outnumbered and outgunned, retreated to their stations and locked the doors, leaving the municipal administration to negotiate directly with armed deserters. The governor of the region declared a state of emergency, but with no loyal military units available to enforce it, the declaration remained a useless piece of paper. The psychological impact on the Russian civilian population has been profound. For years, state propaganda had cultivated an image of absolute military invincibility, assuring the public that the defensive lines were impenetrable and that victory was merely a matter of time. The sudden appearance of a broken, chaotic army on their doorsteps tore that narrative to shreds in an instant. Families of soldiers began demanding answers, besieging military enlistment offices and local administration buildings in provincial cities, demanding to know the whereabouts of their sons, husbands, and brothers. The state's digital censorship apparatus, usually highly efficient, was completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of panic, anger, and leaked information, failing to contain the digital wildfire. In the days following October 14, the area known as the Svatov-Kremenna line has transformed into a surreal, ghostly wasteland. The thousands of kilometers of trenches, once buzzing with the tense energy of thousands of soldiers, are now completely silent. Wind rustles through abandoned camouflage netting, unattended stoves burn out in underground bunkers, and thousands of personal items, letters from home, half-eaten meals, family photographs, lie scattered in the mud. It is a modern-day Marie Celeste on a military scale, a monument to a sudden, collective psychological breaking point where an entire community of men decided, all at once, that the war was over. The long-term lessons of this unprecedented collapse will be studied in military academies for centuries to come. It has exposed the extreme vulnerability of highly centralized, technologically dependent command structures to localized asymmetric information warfare. It proved that numbers on paper, concrete fortifications, and advanced weaponry mean absolutely nothing if the human element within those systems is allowed to rot from neglect, isolation, and despair. The day 100,000 men erased themselves from the front line was not just a failure of a specific military operation, it was the ultimate demonstration of how a modern army can destroy itself from within when the illusion of purpose is finally stripped away.